What if running into a river at midnight felt safer than sleeping under your own roof? What if fire became the only light guiding thousands of families away from their homes? In a single night, Ghana's savannah region was consumed by flames. Entire villages vanished, harvests were abandoned, and more than 13,000 men, women and children stumbled into the darkness, crossing the Black Volta, clutching their children carrying nothing but fear. The heavens were not filled with stars but with burning rooftops. The silence was not safety but terror. And still across Africa's corridors of power, that silence stretched on. No emergency summit, no urgent declaration. ECOWAS and the African Union, so quick to raise their voices when presidents are threatened, had none to offer when ordinary Africans were running for their lives. So ask yourself, what kind of future are we living in when the cries of refugees echo louder than the words of our leaders? This is not only about Ghana, it is a mirror for West Africa. If one land dispute can ignite a refugee crisis in a single night, what storms are waiting in the shadows of your own community? Stay with me until the very end, because the silence of Ghana is more than a tragedy. It may be the warning of Africa's destiny. And if you believe every African life matters, comment amen right now. Every tragedy often begins with something deceptively small, something that could have been solved with reason and dialogue. In Ghana's savannah region, it was not the march of terrorists, not a foreign invasion, not even the shadow of organized crime. It was land. Soil itself, the same ground that had fed generations, suddenly became the fuse that ignited an entire district. Years ago, a local chief signed away part of the community's land to a private real estate developer. The ink dried, the papers were archived, and the deal faded into memory. Until the day the developer finally arrived, armed not with weapons but with bulldozers and blueprints. On the surface, it should have been straightforward: negotiate, immediate resolve. But land in Africa has never been just dirt. It is ancestry. It is memory. It is the graves of mothers and fathers, the shrines of gods, the sweat of farmers, the inheritance of children not yet born. So when the machines rolled in, the villagers rose up and said with one voice, "Not here, not on our land." What followed was not reason, it was eruption. On one side stood the Ganja people, claiming this soil as part of their ancient kingdom. On the other stood the Bryfor, who insisted they had tilled it for countless seasons, long before chiefs signed contracts or developers drew maps. This dispute was not new. It was as old as the very question of who truly owns Africa's land. But this time it would not remain words, it turned bloody. By late August, when tensions boiled over, the chief himself stepped forward, bringing his son, hoping to calm the storm. Instead of peace, he walked into violence. The chief of Kaba was struck down, murdered in the very place he sought to defend. And in African tradition, when a chief's palace is burned, it is no mere rebellion, it is the drumbeat of war. That is exactly what came to pass. Flames swallowed the palace and fire leapt from village to village like a warning flare carried by the wind. What began as a quarrel between neighbors erupted into chaos across 12 communities. Gunfire tore through the night. Houses became torches. Families abandoned everything, vanishing into the bush with only the clothes on their backs. Women and children crowded into police stations, not seeking justice, but clinging to the thin hope of survival. Markets emptied, schools, shuttered, farmers walked away from fields heavy with crops ready for harvest. First reports spoke of 5 or 6 dead. Then the numbers climbed: 10, 15, 31 confirmed. Yet whispers on the ground told a darker story, that the real toll was far higher, hidden by a government desperate to save face. One truth could not be concealed: entire communities had been erased. A dispute over soil had become a humanitarian catastrophe. More than 48,000 people were uprooted. 13,000 were officially recorded as refugees in Côte d'Ivoire. Hundreds more fled into Burkina Faso. Tens of thousands scattered across Ghana itself, too terrified to return to the ashes of their homes. This is Africa's oldest wound land transformed into a weapon. When chiefs sell it, when governments ignore it, when outsiders covet it, the soil itself turns into a battlefield. And every time it is the poorest who bleed first. Commenters across the continent began asking the same uneasy question: what minerals lie beneath this ground? Was it mere coincidence that a developer appeared now, years after the deal was signed? Or was this another act of neo-colonial sabotage? Outsiders lighting the fire and letting Africans burn each other in the blaze. Whether true or not, the suspicion revealed something deeper, a continent where faith in leadership has eroded because land has too often been traded for short-term profit. And in the midst of it all, the silence of power was deafening. ECOWAS looked away. The African Union in New York, speaking lofty words about preventing conflict in Africa, offered no voice for the villages reduced to ash. But silence cannot bury screams forever. When thousands fled their footsteps, carried the truth the world refused to hear. They crossed borders, risked rivers, abandoned their harvests, because the shadow of death felt closer than the promise of life. So the spark on Ghana's soil lit more than flames in Savannah. It lit a warning for all of West Africa. If one quarrel over land can send tens of thousands running into exile, what will happen when the next spark flares in Nigeria, in Mali, in Côte d'Ivoire? The soil had spoken. The sparks had turned to fire, and the fire drove families to the edge of the Black Volta River, where some would rather drown than stay. The Black Volta River had always been a vein of life. Its waters had nourished the fields, carried fish to the tables of the poor, and carved the border between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. But in the final days of August, it became something else entirely, a line between survival and surrender, between life and death. On its banks, mothers clutched their babies tight, whispering prayers as if words alone could part the waters. Fathers dragged sacks of maize until their daughters stumbled, and then dropped the grain to lift their children into their arms. Elderly men leaned heavily on walking sticks, their eyes hollow, fixed on the current, as if searching for mercy in its flow. The decision was merciless: stay and face bullets and fire, or cross and risk being consumed by the river. Some families chose drowning over the certainty of death on land. That is how fear rewrites human instinct when survival is no longer about food in the belly, but about breathing the next breath. In one village, an old woman was seen pushing her grandchildren into a canoe, already buckling under the weight of too many souls. "If we sink, then we sink together," she told them. Behind her, their home smoldered, its roof caving in. That image traveled quickly, families surrendering themselves to the river, not because they wanted to abandon Ghana, but because Ghana had already abandoned them. And yet, even as the Black Volta swallowed hope, despair spilled across borders. By early September, over 13,000 Ghanaians had staggered into Côte d'Ivoire. Another 700 stumbled into Burkina Faso. Some 34,000 remained displaced inside Ghana, scattered in borrowed homes and makeshift shelters. Camps rose overnight, where one bowl of porridge was considered a blessing, where children fell silent, not because they were satisfied, but because hunger had stolen even the strength to cry. The silence of the powerful thundered louder than gunfire. Was the African Union. No emergency calls, no late-night meetings, no press releases. In Accra, government spokesmen stood at podiums and declared the crisis under control. But in the camps, weary fathers muttered, "If this is control, what does collapse look like?" Meanwhile, the words on the ground grew darker, sharper, more dangerous. The Ganja Youth Association proclaimed, "We will defend every inch of our land with our blood." Those words rolled across villages like the echo of war drums. What had begun as a dispute over land was no longer about soil. It was about identity, belonging, and the right to call a place home. From sparks in the earth, a storm was tearing through ethnic lines. At the solar police station, women and children sprawled across the yard, sleeping in the dust beneath the open sky. A reporter asked one woman what she needed most. Her reply pierced deeper than any statistic. "We have not eaten, but we are not hungry. We just want to live." Hunger had been conquered by terror. When even the craving for food is smothered, trauma has already claimed victory. And yet, even in the ashes, questions spread like smoke. Who benefits from this chaos? Why here and why now? Some whispered that the violence had been stoked to destabilize Ghana as it drifted closer to the Sahel bloc. Others pointed to foreign developers flush with cash and protected by unseen hands arriving with paperwork that suddenly seemed more powerful than ancestral claims. Still others accused local chiefs of betraying their people, selling away the ground beneath their own villages. The truth may still be tangled, but the outcome was undeniable: tens of thousands, uprooted, dozens slaughtered, and a government scrambling to conceal the scale of collapse. The Black Volta, once the river that gave life, now stood as the graveyard of trust. But this river was more than Ghana's tragedy. It was a Pan-African warning. If borders cannot contain the displaced, if institutions cannot respond to the cries of the vulnerable, then what does sovereignty mean? Côte d'Ivoire stretched out its hands. Burkina Faso received the frightened. But how long can neighbors shoulder a burden that Ghana itself refuses to carry? The soil was already aflame. The river was already swallowing hope. And now the eyes of a continent turn not to the camps, not to the ashes of villages, but to Accra, to the marble halls of government and the conference rooms of ECOWAS and the AU, where leaders still pretended nothing had happened while the people bore the fire alone. In Accra, the capital life seemed deceptively ordinary. Streets throbbed with traffic, offices opened their doors, diplomats glided past in gleaming convoys. To the casual eye, Ghana looked steady, calm, even prosperous. But the quiet was not peace. It was denial wearing the mask of stability. The government's first reflex was not to stand among the displaced or listen to mothers sleeping on police station floors with children in their arms. Its instinct was force. Over 700 soldiers and police were dispatched northward, and a dusk-to-dawn curfew was declared. The situation is under control, the Inspector General of Police announced with rehearsed confidence. But in the villages, families were still scattering. Schools were still shuttered. Markets remained silent. Harvests rotted in fields no one dared to enter. What kind of control is it when the very people are still running for their lives? Then came the act that stripped away all pretense. President John Dramani. Mahama's most urgent call was not to the mothers in the camps, not to the chiefs of both warring communities, not even to the refugees starving across the border. His call was to the king of the Ganja kingdom, a palace-to-palace conversation. The state leaned not on neutral law or impartial investigation, but on the very traditional power structures that had already set the tinderbox ablaze. It was like giving the wheel back to the driver who had just crashed the car. The government's answer was not reconciliation, but containment. Not justice, but patronage dressed as peace. A committee was promised after consulting the same chiefs whose rivalries had already turned land into fire. Meanwhile, ECOWAS and the African Union staged a different theater. In glittering hotels and polished conference halls, they gathered to debate cyber diplomacy and agricultural modernization. Their communiques sparkled with language. Their speeches rolled off the tongue with ease. Yet not a single line mentioned Ghana's refugees. Not one acknowledgement of thousands of men, women, and children crossing rivers in the dark. It was as if those lives had been erased. This contrast deepened the wound. While ordinary Africans begged for safety, African institutions protected only their image. ECOWAS had threatened sanctions on juntas in Mali and Niger within days. The AU rushed to issue statements on climate change and global summits. But when farmers and children were fleeing barefoot across borders, silence. And silence in this moment was not neutrality, it was betrayal. To the people in camps, it confirmed the fear they already carried in their hearts that ECOWAS and the AU exist to defend presidents, not people. Guardians of power, not guardians of humanity. The imagery was brutal, impossible to ignore. In the north, women lay on bare earth outside the solar police station, cradling children too weak to cry. In the south, officials in press suits sipped bottled water in air-conditioned halls, polishing policies that would never reach the displaced. Two Africas, one bleeding, one pretending. But silence cannot last forever. Refugees may have no microphones, yet their footsteps speak louder than press releases. Each family abandoning their home carried a message more damning than any speech: we no longer believe you can protect us. This was never just a local quarrel. It was a referendum on leadership. Who do institutions serve, the people or the palaces? If the answer is palaces, then the people will cast their vote with their feet. They will run, they will leave, they will abandon not only their homes but their faith in those who claim to lead. The Ghanaian crisis was no longer about Ganja versus Brifor. It was about the failure of a model, the model where governments cling to tradition, where institutions cling to reputation, and citizens cling only to survival. Yet even as Accra and Addis Ababa sank deeper into silence, another voice was rising from Ouagadougou. It was not a voice of denial but of defiance. A voice that dared to speak of dignity, sovereignty, and action. A voice that told Africa it did not have to accept endless camps and endless excuses. That voice belonged to a young soldier president named Ibrahim Traore. While ECOWAS and the African Union drowned in the weight of their own silence, a different rhythm began to rise across the Sahel. It did not echo from marble boardrooms or polished palaces, but from the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. There a young captain-turned-president was speaking in a language the continent had almost forgotten. Not the language of delay, not the language of diplomatic performance, but the language of defiance. His name was Ibrahim Traore, and his words were already crossing borders faster than any convoy or communique. Before him stood not foreign dignitaries in suits, but the people who had always carried Africa's burden, farmers with rough hands, students with worn notebooks, workers still smelling of sweat and soil. His voice was steady, not rehearsed, and it carried like a drumbeat. Africa was not born to live forever in refugee camps. We were not created to abandon our soil, to watch our children run, to see our dignity crushed by silence. If they will not protect us, then we must rise and protect ourselves. Those words did not remain in Ouagadougou. They leapt like sparks into the refugee camps where Ghanaian families huddled under thin tarps and plastic sheets. A boy clutching a cracked phone replayed Traore's speech for his mother. She wept not because her hunger had ended, but because someone finally dared to speak the truth. At least, she whispered, there is one leader who remembers we are still human. The contrast was unforgiving. On one side, ECOWAS leaders polished speeches that nobody read. On the other, a soldier in fatigue spoke straight to the wounds of the people. On one side, the silence of Accra. On the other, the fire of Ouagadougou. For the displaced, this was not theory. It was survival. It was hope. And the echo spread further. Comments poured across Africa's digital squares like water breaking through a dam. From Jamaica came a voice. Thanks for sharing, my brother. We in Jamaica must know what is happening in our motherland. From Papua New Guinea. It is time to embrace each other, to bring healing and make Africa whole again. From Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, from the diaspora in America and Europe, the same refrain thundered back, Unite Africa. Unite Africa. Traore's rise was not simply the tale of one man, it was the reawakening of an idea long buried. That leadership could mean listening, that sovereignty could mean service, that dignity could mean defiance. His words did not extinguish the flames in Ghana, but they reframed them. Suddenly, the crisis was not only tragedy, it was a test. Who would stand with the people? Who would stand with the silence? For many across the continent, the answer became a compass. Burkina Faso under Traore, together with Mali and Niger, the new AES alliance were not perfect, but they were moving. They were breaking ground on roads, tilling fields, mobilizing youth. They were refusing to be trapped by the paralysis of endless conferences. In the eyes of refugees, that action mattered more than polished communiques or staged photos from summits. In one camp, a young man whispered to a reporter, "If Traore were our leader, we would not be here." Whether fair or not, his words captured something larger than himself. Africans had begun measuring leadership not by titles, but by courage. Still, courage alone would never be enough. The wounds in Ghana ran deep, the tribal divisions, the centuries of land disputes, the scars carved by colonial borders. None of that vanished overnight, but something had undeniably shifted. With every WhatsApp video clip shared, with every post that traveled across the diaspora, a counterweight to silence was forming. The silence of ECOWAS had left people abandoned. The voice from Ouagadougou reminded them they had not been erased. The choice was standing naked before the continent. Africa could remain trapped in old rivalries, or it could begin marching to a new drumbeat, a drumbeat of unity, sovereignty, and dignity. Yet unity would demand more than applause for speeches. It would demand tearing down the very walls that had divided Africa for centuries, the lines of tribe, the barriers of language, the scars of colonial cartography. The true test was not in Traore's words, but in whether Africans themselves could move past the divisions that outsiders had always exploited. That question still hangs in the air, waiting for an answer. Tribalism has long been Africa's silent wound. It often begins as pride in ancestry, a way of honoring the past, but too often it is twisted into a weapon sharper than any sword. In Ghana, the Ganja and the Braifor faced each other not as neighbors bound by soil, but as rivals bound by suspicion. One side claimed history, the other claimed presence. For both, the land was not dirt beneath their feet, it was existence itself. When the chief was struck down and his palace went up in flames, the wound tore wide open. Yet here lies the cruel paradox: the very soil that divides can also heal. Across Africa, fields and rivers have never obeyed the colonial maps drawn in faraway capitals. The Bryfour are not confined to Ghana. They live and work in Burkina Faso, in Côte d'Ivoire, in villages where families cross borders for weddings, funerals, and weekly markets. Paper borders may separate them, but bloodlines and language never have. So when violence erupted in Ghana, it was not just a Ghanaian wound. It sent shockwaves across borders, shaking cousins, uncles, and kin who share the same heritage. This has always been the trap outsiders set. During colonial rule, tribes were deliberately pitted against each other, one given privilege the other, stripped of it all, forced to fight over scraps. Divide and conquer was the game. Today the faces are different: developers with crisp contracts, mining firms with deep pockets, politicians desperate for power, but the tactic is the same. They stir up old embers, then stand back as Africans burn each other while wealth is siphoned away. And yet, even in the heart of suffering, resilience glimmered like sparks, refusing to die. In one refugee camp, volunteers gathered children beneath a tree, using the dirt as chalkboards. The children's voices rose as they repeated the alphabet, their words carrying hope into the dust. "We may have lost our homes," a teacher said softly, "but our children will not lose their future." Laughter rippled when one boy raced too quickly through the letters and stumbled on his words. For a moment, hunger and grief gave way to joy. In another corner of the camp, women bent over pots, cooking what little grain they had. They pooled ingredients across families, refusing to let scarcity break their bonds. A mother cradled her child and whispered, "We lost our land, but we still have life." Her smile, fragile but true, was a form of defiance stronger than any political slogan. These glimpses of life matter because they remind us Africa is not defined only by flames, but also by the will to rise from ashes. That is why the message traveling from Ouagadougou struck so deeply. Traore's words did not call people back into tribal boxes. They called them beyond those boxes. Tradition is sacred when it protects dignity, he declared, but when it destroys dignity, it becomes a chain. Across digital comment sections, the diaspora echoed this truth like a chorus. Unite Africa, one policy, one army, one destiny. From Jamaica to Mozambique, from Trinidad to Paris, Africans and their descendants repeated what the refugees already knew. Division is death, but unity is survival. The shift was subtle yet powerful. What began as a local tragedy was morphing into a continental reflection. In the camps, Ghanaians began to see their struggle not as an isolated misfortune, but as part of a larger African story. If tribal boundaries could not protect them, maybe African unity could. This is why the silence of ECOWAS and the AU cut so painfully. Because in that silence, the people were left to imagine their own solutions. And in imagining, they turned not to gilded palaces or scripted speeches, but to the courage of ordinary Africans and to leaders like Traore, who embodied defiance against despair. The old game had always been division. The new demand, rising louder each day, was unity. But the question hung heavy in the air: who would answer the call? Would Africa's destiny be carved in air-conditioned halls or in the dusty camps where children still recited alphabets beneath the trees? The story of Ghana's refugees cannot be allowed to end at the edge of a riverbank. It cannot stop in the dust of camps where mothers barter bowls of grain or where children trace alphabets in the sand beneath a tree. To leave the story, there would be to accept despair as destiny. And Africa has never been a continent of resignation. Africa has always been a continent of return, of coming back stronger than before. Picture this: years from now, the same families who once fled in terror step once again across the Black Volta River. But this time they do not arrive as victims. They return as builders, no longer carrying their children on their backs while running, but carrying bricks, seeds, and books in their hands. Where villages once smoldered, homes will rise not as replicas of the past, but as monuments to survival. This is not fantasy. This is the arc of Africa's story, from ashes into renewal, from exile into restoration. But for that arc to bend toward renewal, the silence of today must be shattered by the voices of tomorrow. And here the diaspora has a sacred role to play. From Kingston to Accra, from Port-au-Prince to Ouagadougou, Africans abroad are already calling out with one refrain: Unite Africa, one policy, one army, one destiny. These are not empty hashtags drifting across screens. They are drumbeats of a generation refusing to bow. They echo the call of leaders like Ibrahim Traore, whose defiance in Burkina Faso, latest news reminds the world that sovereignty is not theory. It is practice, it is survival, it is power lived. When Traore speaks, he does not pretend Burkina Faso is free of hardship. He speaks as a soldier who has lived through hardship. But he also speaks as a leader who refuses silence. His words now move across borders into Mali, Niger, and into the hearts of Ghanaians, who wonder whether their suffering could be transformed into a turning point. Burkina Faso, latest news is not only about policies or programs. It is proof that Africa can take action without waiting for permission slips from foreign powers. And that is the lesson waiting for Ghana. Refugees do not have to remain refugees. Camps can become schools, farms, and communities of rebirth. The very people who lost everything can become the architects of a future no one thought possible. They can join hands with neighbors, with AES partners, with movements already pulsing with determination. ECOWAS may have abandoned them in silence, but the people of Africa, through their unity and defiance, can lift them higher than any institution ever could. Do not underestimate the power of symbols. A mother cooking one meal to feed 3 families is not merely surviving, she is modeling solidarity. A child laughing as he stumbles through letters is not merely learning, he is proclaiming that trauma will not have the final word. These small acts are bricks, and bricks when carried together build nations. But for the walls of despair to fall, unity must rise taller than tribal divisions. That is why the words of Traore matter, not because he is a savior, but because he is a mirror. He reflects the dignity Africans already hold. He reflects the possibility of action instead of waiting. He reflects the dream that Burkina Faso, latest news, has made visible, that sovereignty is not a slogan, it is a survival strategy, a way of reclaiming tomorrow. So the question is no longer whether Ghana will recover. The question is whether Africa will learn. Will we keep waiting for ECOWAS communiques that erase the people, or will we take responsibility for our own soil? Will we keep letting tribal rivalries chain us, or will we choose to define ourselves as one Africa indivisible? The fire in Savannah was not just a Ghanaian tragedy, it was a continental warning. If a land dispute can become mass displacement overnight, then every African village is a potential battlefield unless unity transforms soil into solidarity. But if refugees rise as builders, if silence transforms into defiance, if despair gives way to renewal, then Ghana's story becomes more than a scar. It becomes a signpost. It becomes living proof that even in the darkest night, Africa can choose dawn. This is why your voice matters. Comment your country below so Ghanaians know they are not abandoned. Share this video so silence cannot bury the truth. And if you believe Africa can rise from its own ashes, type "rise" in the comments right now. Because the future of Africa will not be written in the polished boardrooms of Accra or the marble halls of Addis Ababa. It is already being written in the footsteps of refugees who refuse to surrender, in the voices of diaspora who refuse to forget, and in the defiance of leaders like Ibrahim Traore who refuse to stay silent. We were not born to live in camps. We were not created to run forever. We were created to build. And if you believe that truth, then this is your moment, not just to watch history, but to shape it. The night of silence is over. The drumbeat of dignity has begun. Ghana's refugees are not only running from fire, they are running toward a new future. And Africa must have the courage to run beside them.